So what's going to follow is I'm going to do a full reading of the second temporary restraining order that the judge administered to the Trump administration. The reason why is because it provides a good backstory on how we got here and all of the arguments up until this point, and he does a very good job excoriating the Trump administration and the games that they're basically playing because they do not want to pay these SNAP benefits. And yes, there is some weird, funny business with the money, and that is covered in the order. But before we get there, I think it's important to go through a timeline because the timeline is going to be a little bit confusing. Okay, so government shuts down October 1st. Then people start getting wind from the administration that they're not going to pay SNAP benefits. Okay, cool. So a bunch of people get together. The group is called, I think, like Rhode Island Churches. I just call them Rhode Island. Rhode Island says, we're going to sue the USDA. So they drop the lawsuit on October 30th. They get a ruling from the judge on October 31st. That's an oral ruling. That ruling is then written down November 1st and handed to the administration because Trump said, we need guidance on how to do this. So the judge said, bet, and he wrote everything down. So November 1st, that's TRO1. That's what it's called. TRO1 gave the USDA two options. First option was they get to partial payment, which would be a slower option because they had never done it before, so it would be new, and a full payment, which would be the fastest option. USDA chose a partial payment. Now, USDA says it only has $4.65 billion in the account. There is some weird business with the numbers, which is discussed. But they say we only have $4.65 billion, so we're going to do the partial payment, which is slower. Because of that, we got two different timelines, or two different deadlines, effectively. As of November 1st, if they choose a full payment, which is the fastest option, it was going to be due on November 3rd. If they chose a partial payment, which was the slowest option, it was going to be due on November 5th, right? November 5th comes, and they're not in compliance. And we get hints from, not hints, we get a full-blown social media post saying that they're not going to distribute SNAP funds until the Democrats reopen the government. That's what Donald Trump wrote on his social media site. So Rhode Island comes through November 5th and says, hey, judge, they're not going to comply, so we need you to do one of two things. We need you to either force them to comply with your TRO, the first one, or issue a new one. Judge said, bet, we're going to do TRO 2, and TRO 2 is you're going to pay this money, all of it. And they talk about where to get the money from. That's the timeline, so off to the reading.
Okay, so this is from the second TRO, where basically that judge went off on the Department of Agriculture. Factual and procedural background. This case already has an unusually lengthy factual and procedural history in the short time since it was filed. As such, the court begins with a brief recounting of that history. In the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2024, Congress appropriated more than $122 billion for necessary expenses to carry out the SNAP program, and of that sum directed $3 billion to remain available through September 30th, 2026, shall be placed in reserve for use only in such amounts and at such times as may become necessary to carry out program operations. Congress maintained those funding levels for the SNAP program in the full year continuing appropriations and extensions act of 2025, meaning that an additional $3 billion was put aside in reserve available through September 30th, 2027. Collectively, these funds amount to $6 billion in appropriated funds for SNAP, referred to here as contingency funds. On October 1st, 2025, when Congress failed to pass appropriations legislation for fiscal year 2026, the United States entered a government shutdown. On October 10th, 2025, in response to the shutdown, USDA announced its intention to continue funding the Special Supplemental Nutrition Program for Women and Infants and Children, or WIC. To do so, the agency stated that it would be using money from a fund created by Section 32 of the Agricultural Adjustment Act of 1935. As of October 9th, 2025, there are over $23 billion in this fund. Meanwhile, on the same day, October 1st, USDA issued a memo informing state officials that if the current lapse in appropriations continues, there will be insufficient funds to pay full November SNAP benefits for approximately 42 million individuals across the nation. Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program SNAP benefit and the Administrative Expense Update for November 2025. A few weeks later, on October 24th, 2025, USDA issued another memo stating that effective November 1st, 2025, it would be suspending all November 2025 benefit allotments until such time as sufficient federal funding is provided or until Food and Nutrition Service directs state agencies otherwise. Memorandum from U.S. Department of Agriculture. The memo further directed states to take immediate action to implement this suspension. In a separate memo issued the same day, USDA asserted that SNAP contingency funds were not available to support FY 2026 regular benefits because the appropriation for regular benefits no longer exists. Okay. On or about October 27, 2025, USDA posted a prominent banner on its website that the well has run dry for SNAP benefits and that Senate Democrats were to blame for not voting to reopen the government so mothers, babies, and the most vulnerable among us can receive critical nutrition assistance. The banner further stated that there will be no benefits issued November 1st. On October 30th, a group composed of cities, unions, nonprofits from across the country, collectively the plaintiffs, brought this action seeking a temporary restraining order compelling the USDA to disperse funds to be used for the SNAP program. The plaintiffs argued that contrary to the USDA's claim that the well has run dry, the agency has two revenue sources from which it could pull to fund SNAP: the approximately $6 billion in contingency funds and two, the approximately $23 billion in Section 32 funds. They further argued the agency's decision to not fund SNAP violated the Administrative Procedure Act, or the APA. October 31st, this court held a virtual hearing in which it granted the plaintiffs' request for a TRO. Specifically, the court found that the plaintiffs were substantially likely to succeed on the merits of their APA claim because the USDA's decision to cut off SNAP funding was contrary to law and arbitrary and capricious. The court reasoned that the contingency funds for SNAP are appropriated funds that are necessary to carry out the program's operations, and that USDA provided no explanation as to why the contingency funds could not be used, even though the agency had previously acknowledged in 2019 during the first Trump administration that such funds could be used during a government shutdown. The court further found that irreparable harm would occur if millions of people were forced to go without funds for food, and it held that the balance of equities and the public interest weighed in favor of the plaintiffs. Accordingly, the court orally ordered the defendants to distribute funds to SNAP beneficiaries as soon as possible and to submit a report by 12 p.m. on November 3rd, 2025, as to how it planned to comply with the court's order. Following the hearing, the defendants filed a motion in which they requested that the court reduce its TRO to writing because they were, quote, expeditiously attempting to comply with the court's order. That same day, President Trump stated, quote, "I do not want Americans to go hungry. I ask the court to clarify how we can legally fund SNAP as soon as possible. If we are given the appropriate legal direction by the court, it will be my honor to provide the funding," end quote. On November 25th, this court issued that requested legal direction. It explicitly provided the defendants with two options to address the irreparable harm wrought by a lapse in funding for the SNAP program. First, the defendants could, within their discretion, use Section 32 funds, contingency funds, or both. So they're talking about Section 32 funds, and the contingency funds are the $6 billion that Congress put aside specifically for SNAP. So they could use Section 32 funds, contingency funds, or both to fully fund November SNAP benefits by Monday, November 3rd, 2025. If they chose not to provide full funding, their decision had to be made in accordance with the APA and could not be arbitrary or capricious. Second, the defendants could use contingency funds to make a partial payment of SNAP benefits by Wednesday, November 5th, 2025. If the defendants chose this option, then they would have had to expeditiously resolve the administrative and clerical burdens associated with making partial payments. On November 3rd, the defendants filed I'm going to have to understand, this timeline is very odd to me. On November 3rd, the defendants filed a status report in which they indicated that they would be proceeding with the second option. Specifically, the defendants stated that they would partially fund SNAP by using $4.65 billion in contingency funds to cover 50% of the benefits due to each SNAP recipient for the month of November. This has a footnote. 2. As the defendants explained, at the beginning of fiscal year 2026, there was a total of $6 billion in SNAP contingency funds. The Food and Nutrition Service used $450 million from those funds for SNAP, state agencies' administrative expenses, and an additional $300 million for the Nutrition Assistance Program block grants for Puerto Rico and American Samoa. According to the defendants, this would leave $4.65 billion in contingency funds for November SNAP benefits. However, the court ran the numbers, and this leaves $5.2 billion remaining in contingency funds, not $4.65 billion. The defendants do not explain this $600 million discrepancy. So there's funny business going on with what they're doing with that money. Anyway, continuing on. However, a senior USDA official claimed that issuance of these partial payments could take anywhere from a few weeks up to several months due to procedural difficulties. So we're going to go with option 2, which was partial funding, but the partial funding has its own difficulties. According to the defendants, USDA has never had to issue partial SNAP benefits before, and that such an action involves massive and novel system changes filled with procedural difficulties that states will likely experience, which would affect November SNAP benefits reaching households in a timely manner and in the corrected reduced amounts. Okay, so that explains the weird-ass timeline. So, according to that USDA official, it is a lot easier for them to fund the program fully because they have all of the machinations and the systems and, everything's already in place, right? They don't have to do anything to do full funding. They just got to get the funds and then distribute the funds. However, to implement a partial fund would require that they have to go through more work. So the way that it's set up now, full funding, very easy to do. We already know what to do. But to do partial funding, we got to update tables. We got to update systems. We got to make sure that, that every person, like if you're only supposed to get $200 in SNAP benefits, they have to make sure that you get exactly $100 in SNAP benefits, right? So they likely have to update some software system. So the point is they have to implement a lot of changes to do partial funding. It sounds counterintuitive, but it's really not when you think about it. If they already have all the framework in place right now, they don't have to do anything to do full funding. But to do partial funding, yeah, it's going to require a lot of updates because every state is different and every state is different on the requirements in order for you to qualify for said funds. So they're going to have to do a whole lot of updates to the system just to cut the benefits in half. These difficulties include state agencies having to recode their eligibility systems to adjust for the reduced maximum allotments, states having to reduce benefits within their systems either through an automated manner with minimal disruption versus manual overrides or computations that could lead to payment errors and significant delays, states having to handle any requests for fair hearings from SNAP households related to the reduction. Okay, I didn't think about that one, but they're right, i.e. they could be sued. Not necessarily, well, maybe not sued, but you're likely going to have people petitioning SNAP in their state regarding, well, why was my payment cut? That type of stuff, right? Also, in their status report, the defendants state that USDA has determined not to use Section 32 Child Nutrition Program funds or other funds to provide full SNAP benefits for the month of November. Their reasoning behind electing to not fully fund the program was that doing so, one, strays from congressional intent that Section 32 funds be used only for child nutrition programs. Two, would leave a $4 billion gap in the child nutrition program funding that Congress would not replenish with annual appropriations. Three, would leave child nutrition programs which feed no fewer than 29 million children with an unprecedented and significant shortfall. The next day, November 4th, the plaintiffs filed a motion to enforce the court's TRO. They made two arguments. First, they claimed the defendants were failing to comply with the court's order to expeditiously make partial payments by Wednesday, November 5th, because they failed to resolve the associated administrative and clerical burdens as the court required. Second, they asserted that the defendants' decision not to make full payments violates the APA and was made in arbitrary and capricious manner, which directly contravenes the court orders. I mean, and that makes sense. If you're gonna go through the partial route, which imposes an undue burden on the states, you as a USDA need to mitigate that burden. But according to the plaintiffs, they're saying they weren't doing any of that. The plaintiffs requested that the court enforce its existing order by entering a further order requiring defendants to make full SNAP payments for November immediately. In the alternative, they requested that the court enter a new TRO and preliminary stay, setting aside USDA's decision not to provide full funding for the November SNAP benefits and compelling the agency to revert to the long-standing status quo ante of fully funding SNAP benefits. Within an hour of the plaintiffs filing their motion, the president issued another social media post in which he stated that, quote, SNAP benefits, which increased by billions and billions of dollars many-fold during crooked Joe Biden's disastrous term in office, due to the fact that they were haphazardly handed to anyone for the asking as opposed to just those in need, which is the purpose of SNAP, will be given only when the radical left Democrats open up government, which they can easily do and not before. Thank you for your attention to this matter, President DJT. Shortly thereafter, plaintiffs filed a supplemental notice asserting that this statement from the president demonstrated the defendants were threatening defiance of the court's order. The defendants then filed their own supplemental notice, attempting to walk back the president's statement and claim that they were complying with the court's order because USDA had notified the states of the reduction in SNAP benefits and generated the table required for the states to calculate the benefits available for each household in that state. So they're saying that they were working on it, I guess. In the evening of November 5th, the plaintiffs filed another supplemental notice. In it, the plaintiffs provided further evidence that they claimed demonstrated the defendants were in non-compliance with the court's order. They provided a declaration from an analyst who explained that contrary to the defendants' claim that USDA intended to spend the full $4.65 billion in contingency funds, a 50% reduction in benefits for each SNAP recipient would cause the agency to disperse only $3 billion and leave $1.5 billion in contingency funds unspent, i.e., that 50% reduction, they're not going to spend the whole amount that Congress set aside. So Congress set aside $6 billion. They said they spent about $750 million for other programs, which according to their calculations leaves $4.65 billion. Problem is, that's not an accurate amount, right? So there's a $600 billion discrepancy. We don't know where that money went. But everything is running off of their number of $4.65 billion, which is already in question. This is so bad. And their $4.65 billion, they're saying, well, we're only going to fund half of the benefits. And they ran the numbers, and at least according to their analyst, that disbursement is only $3 billion, which means they still have $1.5 billion left. So they're not spending all of the contingency funds, which is a violation of the TRO. Very soon after, the defendants responded with another notice, defendants in this case are the USDA, of their own. In it, they conceded that they had committed an error in directing the states to implement a 50% reduction in SNAP benefits. The defendants explained that after further calculations, USDA had concluded that only a 35% reduction, not a 50% reduction, was necessary to deplete SNAP contingency funds, and that it had issued revised allotment tables to the states. The defendants claimed that this revised decision was not made in response to plaintiffs' notice filed earlier this evening, but that they acknowledged having to make this revision and send updated guidance to the states in a filing submitted earlier that day. After careful review of the parties, they're trying to say, no, we're not trying to slow walk this at all. We're not playing games. We promise. Like, we're not in violation of the restraining order. I guarantee you, this is why that judge was so pissed when he wrote this. After careful review of the party submissions, the court held a hearing on this matter on November 6th at 3:30 p.m. in which it issued an oral ruling from the bench. The following discussion sets forth the court's reasoning in greater detail, which formed the basis for its oral order. Section A, partial funding decision. In its TRO, the court gave the defendants two options: to either use contingency funds to make partial payment of SNAP benefits, or use Section 32 funds, contingency funds, or both to make full payment of SNAP benefits. If the defendants chose to proceed with option 1, they were required to expeditiously resolve the administrative and clerical burdens it described in its papers, and that under no circumstances shall the partial payments be made later than Wednesday, November 5th. The record is clear that the defendants did neither. The defendants contend that they have fully complied with the court's order by providing the contingency funds to the states for SNAP benefits. The defendants filed an emergency motion under the sentiment that they were expeditiously attempting to comply with the court's order. They also stated in their status report that they have worked diligently to comply with the court's order, and they supplemented their report with a declaration from a USDA official who explained how USDA is complying with the court's order and will fulfill its obligation to expend the full amount of SNAP contingency funds. Footnote: on Wednesday, November 6th, the defendants stated in a filing that they had fully complied with the court's order and issued tables to the states to that effect. As of that time, the defendants assured the court that contingency funds have now been provided to the states for payment. But then mere hours later, the defendants stated that they had committed an error and had to send revised tables to the states. Yeah, they're playing games. This admission makes clear that compliance by Wednesday, November 5th, as required by the court order, had not been achieved, as their full compliance required further revisions. That's an error. It's supposed to be November 5th. It happens. Anyway, continuing on. Far from being expeditious, the court suggests quite the opposite. As of the date of this decision, SNAP recipients still have not received their benefits. The defendants contend that there are procedural difficulties that make it so that partial SNAP payments will take anywhere from a few weeks to up to several months to be dispersed. They claim that reducing the amount of SNAP benefits that each recipient receives is a massive and novel system change that requires the USDA to issue revised tables so that each state may calculate by what percentage maximum SNAP allotments are to be reduced. The defendants asserted that there is nothing more USDA could do. Even before this court's order was entered, the defendants were fully aware of the delay and potential errors that a partial payment would involve. USDA has never implemented a reduction in SNAP benefits under 7 CFR 271.7 because no template processes or experience exists to inform a reduction in benefits. There are multiple variables that could lead to significant problems in attempting to reduce benefits for every SNAP household in the country. Furthermore, as the plaintiffs point out, the defendants could have begun working to resolve the administrative hurdles once the lapse in appropriations occurred or even before. Basically, if you already knew you had $4.65 billion in contingency funds and you were only going to do a partial payment, they should have thought about that before and started working on those tables, working on all those revisions needed so that by the time because the government shutdown occurred on the 1st of October. So they're basically saying y'all had like 30 days to figure this out. This is especially true given that USDA had previously, during the first Trump administration in 2019, contemplated such a use of contingency funds during the government shutdown. This plainly makes clear that this is a problem that could have been avoided. The defendants knew that at the time they chose option 1, they would be prolonging implementation and frustrating the very purpose of the TRO, which is to provide timely relief and prevent further irreparable harm. Now, I know it's kind of crazy that they gave him option 1, but it's one of those things where it's like, give him enough rope. I feel like this may be part of some weird strategy. I don't know. But the point is that even giving them option 1 makes it very clear what they want to do. It makes it very clear what they want to do. And that their purpose is to slow walk this whole thing so they don't provide SNAP benefits. Continuing on, they instead proceeded fully aware that option 2 provided a faster and more practical means of compliance. Yeah, I feel like they set them up a little bit. I really do. So they knew option 2 was faster. They knew option 1 was slower, which was the partial payments, but they chose the slower option. I see this. Okay. The defendants overlooked the fundamental point that compliance is achieved when a Americans are fed, not when the federal government shifts the administrative burden of dispersing funds to the states. Ooh, especially when there is still no clear disbursement date in sight. Footnote number 5. In fact, the president has stated his intent to defy court's order when he posted on social media that, quote, SNAP benefits will be given only when the radical left Democrats open up government and not before. So continuing on, by doing so, the defendants have undermined both the intent and the effectiveness of this court's October 31st oral order and its November 1st written order that the defendants act expeditiously. The court is not inclined to excuse this non-compliance, particularly where the obstacles the defendants now invoke are the foreseeable result of their own choices. Oh, they really set them up. They set them up. But the thing is, it's like the first TRO, which gave them the partial payment option, effectively, it was like a trap, and they walked right into that motherfucker. This is crazy. Legal shit is funny. Therefore, the court grants the plaintiff's motion to enforce. Consistent with prior orders, the court hereby orders the administration to make full SNAP payments to the states by Friday, November 7th, 2025, by utilizing available Section 32 funds in combination with the contingency funds. Full funding decision. Along with their motion to enforce, the plaintiffs they argued that in addition to the defendants failing to comply with the court's order that partial SNAP payments be made expeditiously, the defendants also failed to comply with the court's order that any decision not to provide full SNAP payments for the month of November be made in accordance with the APA, and that such decision could not be arbitrary or capricious. The argument is addressed below. As an initial matter, the defendants argue that USDA's decision not to expend Section 32 funds is unreviewable by this court because it is committed to agency discretion by law. The defendants rely on Lincoln v. Vigil to support their argument that USDA's funding decision is entirely discretionary and that as such this court has no leave to intrude. In making this argument, the defendants ignore a key tenet of the APA, which is that the statute establishes a basic presumption of judicial review for one suffering legal wrong because of agency action. To honor this presumption, the Supreme Court has read this agency discretion exemption quite narrowly, finding that it only applies in those rare circumstances where the relevant statute is drawn so that the court would have no meaningful standard against which to judge the agency's exercise of discretion. Historically, these rare circumstances have been limited to only a few specific types of decisions, such as a decision not to institute enforcement proceedings, or a decision by an intelligence agency to terminate an employee in the interest of national security. Neither of these rare circumstances are currently before the court. In addition, the APA requires the court to hold unlawful and set aside agency action that is found to be arbitrary, capricious, and abuse of discretion or otherwise not in accordance with law. The Supreme Court has also recently explained that the command of the APA is that the reviewing court, not the agency whose actions it reviews, is to decide all relevant questions of law and interpret statutory provisions. Agency interpretations of statutes are not entitled to deference, and it is indeed the responsibility of the court to decide whether the law means what the agency says. Here, the court has jurisdiction to review this action. As the defendants have acknowledged, a key dispute in this case is over how certain statutory provisions authorize USDA to expend Section 32 funds. This is a question that falls squarely within the APA's command that courts, not agencies, decide all relevant questions of law. In addition, the court has an obligation to ensure that the agency is not acting in an arbitrary and capricious manner in its decision-making process. Having determined that USDA's actions are reviewable, the court now proceeds to the merits of the plaintiff's request for a new TRO. The merits. In evaluating a motion for a TRO, the court considers 1. The plaintiff's likelihood of success on the merits. 2. The possibility that, without an injunction, the plaintiffs will suffer irreparable harm. 3. The balance of equities between the parties. And 4, the effect of the court's ruling on the public interest. At this stage, the irreparable harm, balance of equities, and public interest considerations are virtually the same as those raised by the parties during the October 31st, 2025 hearing before this court. The court found that all 3 factors weighed in the plaintiff's favor. As such, the only relevant consideration here is the plaintiff's likelihood of success on the merits of their claim. The plaintiffs claim that the defendant's decision not to provide full SNAP funding for the month of November was an arbitrary and capricious decision and that it must be set aside. They advanced 4 arguments to support their claim. 1. The defendants failed to account for the practical consequences of its decision to only partially fund SNAP. 2. The defendants' reasoning rested on a flawed understanding of USDA's statutory authority and Congress's intent. 3. The defendant's child nutrition reasoning was implausible and contrary to the evidence. And 4. The defendant's desire to conserve funding for child nutrition is pretextual, and their decision was instead motivated by a partisan political advantage. The court addresses each argument in turn, failing to account for practical consequences of partial funding. An agency rule is arbitrary and capricious if the agency entirely failed to consider an important aspect of the problem. It would also be arbitrary and capricious for the agency to ignore long-standing policies that may have engendered serious reliance interest that must be taken into account. The plaintiffs assert that the defendants have failed to consider how its decision to provide only partial benefits will cause immense harm to beneficiaries who will go without food assistance during potentially lengthy delays. The court agrees. The procedural difficulties that the defendants note in their status report stem from their decision to implement reduced benefits rather than full benefits. According to the defendants, implementing such benefit reduction requires the states to make massive and novel system changes, such as their having to 1. Recode their eligibility systems to adjust for the reduced maximum allotments. 2. Reduce benefits within their systems either through an automated manner with minimal disruption versus manual overrides or computations that could lead to payment errors and significant delays. And 3. Handle any requests for fair hearings from SNAP households related to the reduction. As a result of these procedural difficulties, partial SNAP payments could be delayed by a few weeks up to several months. Again, the court finds it astounding that the defendants would even choose to go down this path if they were aware of all the difficulties and delays that such partial payment of SNAP benefits would entail. What then of the tens of millions of Americans who rely on the SNAP program? Nowhere in its decision did USDA consider the increased harm that will befall these recipients if they are forced to go without food for a few weeks up to several months. This is precisely the irreparable harm that the court contemplated when it issued its TRO, which is why the defendants were required to act expeditiously to ensure the quick and orderly and efficient implementation of the court's order and to alleviate the irreparable harm that the court found exists without timely payment of SNAP benefits. The government should, within its discretion, find the additional funds necessary beyond the contingency funds to fully fund the November SNAP payments. Simply disregarding this important aspect of the problem and the serious reliance interest is patently arbitrary and capricious. Argument 2. Apprehending USDA's statutory authority and Congress's intent. An agency action that is premised on a legal error is arbitrary and capricious and must be set aside. If the action is based upon a determination of law as to which the reviewing authority of the courts does come into play, an order may not stand if the agency has misconceived the law. Throughout their briefing, the defendants conflate Section 32 funds with the child nutrition programs to make it seem as if they go in tandem. In essence, the defendants claim that Section 32 funds are to be used exclusively to fund the child nutrition programs and that to use those funds for other purposes was straight from congressional intent. The plaintiffs argue that this is a misapprehension of the USDA's statutory authority and of congressional intent. Again, the court agrees. Section 32 of the Agricultural Adjustment Act of 1935 states in relevant part, quote, Congress has set forth a mandatory and permanent appropriation that stems from 30% of customs receipts on all imports from the prior calendar year, end quote. While much of this funding has been appropriated to the child nutrition program, there is no statute prohibiting USDA from using the funding for other purposes. Rather, USDA has the authority under 7 USC Section 2257 to authorize transfer of these funds interchangeably for the miscellaneous expenses of the work of any bureau, division, or office of the Department of Agriculture. In fact, USDA conceded to, at the beginning of the current government shutdown, transferring $300 million in Section 32 funds to support the Special Supplemental Nutrition Program for WIC. This clearly undermines the defendant's point, as WIC is an entirely separate program from the Child Nutrition Program. As such, the defendant's reasoning relies on a legal error that renders their decision arbitrary and capricious. Argument 3. Providing reasoning that is implausible and contrary to the evidence. An agency action is arbitrary and capricious if it runs counter to the evidence before the agency and is so implausible that it could not be ascribed to a difference in view. The defendants contend that transferring Section 32 funds to fully fund SNAP for the month of November creates an unacceptable risk because shifting $4 billion to America's SNAP population merely shifts the problem to millions of Americans' low-income children that receive their meals at school. They claim that such a transfer would leave child nutrition programs, which feed no fewer than 29 million children, with an unprecedented and significant shortfall that would not be replenished by Congress in a later appropriations bill. Footnote number 6. In subsequent briefing, the defendants also argue that USDA risks violating the Appropriations Clause and the Anti-Deficiency Act if it is forced to disperse Section 32 funds to SNAP. The Appropriations Clause provides no money can be paid out of the Treasury unless it has been appropriated by an act of Congress. The Anti-Deficiency Act similarly prevents agencies from obligating or spending funds absent congressional appropriation. The defendant's argument is unconvincing given that Congress has explicitly authorized the use of Section 32 funds in this way. It's like everything that they're doing, every argument that they're making, is solely to not spend this money. The plaintiffs challenge this claim as contrary to the evidence and implausible. The court agrees with the plaintiffs. It is highly unlikely that USDA's transfer of Section 32 funds would lead to immediate and permanent gaps in child nutrition program funding, as the defendants suggest. The plaintiffs rightfully point out that transferring $4 billion to fully fund November SNAP benefits would still leave $19.35 billion in Section 32 account. Given that it costs USDA approximately $3 billion per month to administer the child nutrition program, such a transfer would still leave enough to fully fund child nutrition through May 26 and beyond, even if the current lapse in appropriations lasted that long. In addition, the defendant's decision to not fully fund SNAP reflects their determination that those funds must remain available to protect full operation of the child nutrition programs throughout the fiscal year instead of being used for SNAP benefits. They state quite definitively that such a transfer will result in a $4 billion gap that would not be filled by Congress and represents a permanent loss to the program. But as the defendants readily acknowledge, USDA cannot predict what Congress will do. Congress may choose to replenish the funds for the child nutrition programs during the next appropriation cycle, or it may choose to appropriate additional funds to SNAP, amounts which could in turn be transferred to the child nutrition account under Section 257 to reimburse it for the amounts that account covered. The point is that USDA does not know how Congress will use its power of the purse, so it cannot rest on the assumption that Congress will simply do nothing. One final point here. Contrary to the defendant's claim, 29 million children who participate in the child nutrition program are not at risk of immediately going hungry in the event of a transfer of Section 32 funds. Instead, SNAP recipients, 16 million of whom are children, will go hungry if they do not receive their SNAP benefits this month. In other words, it defies belief that the defendants will prioritize a hypothetical disruption in child food assistance, projected to occur no sooner than May 26th, if at all, over the very real and immediate risk of children being deprived of their food assistance today. Taken together, the defendant's arguments run so contrary to the evidence and are so implausible as to make them arbitrary and capricious. Argument 4. Providing reasoning that is pretextual. Providing a pretextual reasoning for taking agency action that is incongruent with what the record reveals about the agency's priorities and decision-making process can be a basis for setting aside agency action as arbitrary and capricious. Courts are not required to exhibit a naivete from which ordinary citizens are free. They must ensure that agencies offer genuine justifications for important decisions. Relatedly, decisions featuring unjustifiable bias or partisanship are precisely the types of agencies' actions that would work in violation of the arbitrary and capricious standard. The plaintiff's fourth and final argument is that the defendant's stated desire to conserve funding for child nutrition programs is a pretext, and that the real reason USDA chose not to fully fund SNAP was for partisan political purposes. The court once again agrees with the plaintiffs. The defendant's stated desire to conserve funding for child nutrition programs seems entirely pretextual, given the numerous statements made in recent weeks by Trump administration officials who make clear that SNAP benefits are being withheld for political reasons. First, the defendant's claim is undercut by the banner, the USDA's website, which began on or about October 27, 2025, provided that the well has run dry on SNAP benefits and that Senate Democrats are to blame for the lapse in funding. That the well has run dry cannot be so if, as recent as 2019, the first Trump administration's agricultural acknowledged that contingency funds could be used to fund SNAP during a government shutdown. Even more striking is the fact that since this court issued its order requiring USDA to fund SNAP during the shutdown, the at issue, the well has run dry language, has disappeared from the USDA's website. Second, and most notably, defendant's claim is further undermined by President Trump's recent statements on social media. Initially, the president stated, "If we are given appropriate legal direction by the court, it will be my honor to provide funding." Despite clear legal direction from this court, and despite the defendant's indication in a filing of their intent to comply with that order, the president nevertheless threatened to withhold SNAP benefits until the end of the government shutdown. Quote, "SNAP benefits will be given only when the radical left Democrats open up government, which they can easily do and not before." End quote. This court is not naive to the administration's true motives. Far from being concerned with the child nutrition funding, these statements make clear that the administration is withholding full SNAP benefits for political purposes. Such unjustifiable partisanship has infected the USDA's decision-making, rendering it arbitrary and capricious. The remedy. Based on the above reasoning, the court finds that the plaintiffs have satisfied the requirements for the issuance of a second TRO. First, the plaintiffs have demonstrated a likelihood of success on the merits of their APA claim. Second, the court has already determined that irreparable harm is substantially likely to occur, harm that only increased due to the defendant's failure to comply with the court's prior order. Third, the balance of the equities of the public interest weighs strongly in the plaintiff's favor. As such, the plaintiffs have satisfied the requirements for the issuance of a new TRO. The court grants the plaintiff's motion for a new TRO, and the defendants are hereby ordered to make full payment of November SNAP benefits to the states by Friday, November 7th, 2025, by utilizing available Section 32 funds in combination with the contingency funds. For the reasons stated above, the plaintiff's motions to enforce is granted, as well as the plaintiff's motion for a new TRO. The defendants are ordered to make full payments of November SNAP benefits to the states by Friday, November 7th, by utilizing Section 32 funds in combination with the contingency funds.